Okay, this is a book review. Here's the book, Zombie Science, More Icons of Evolution. The author's name is Jonathan Wells. This is Jonathan Wells. This is a really smart guy. When he was in high school, he had a perfect score on his SATs. He went on to get a PhD in some of the biological sciences, went to Princeton. I tell you about him because his book is great, Icons of Evolution, and that was his original book. And then he wrote this second book called Zombie Science, More Icons of Evolution. The word zombie comes from the idea of the walking dead. And what he's referring to is there's lots of claims of evolutionary biology promoters that something shows evidence of evolution, but then it gets proved false, and they keep on putting it back in the textbook. The reason is they don't have any evidence to support macroevolution. You need to know these terms, so let me explain them to you real fast. There's microevolution. Microevolution is the concept of variation within a species. Like there's different types of dogs. You can selectively breed for a different type of dog. A big dog, a little dog. Same thing with horses. A big horse, a plow horse, a race horse. You know, that's known and that makes sense. However, there is no explanation for the origin of life. There is no explanation for the origin of complexity. There's no explanation for the origin of different body types, different phyla. And what evolutionary biology tends to try to do is, because it can help explain the idea of dogs, you selectively breed for traits, which isn't really saying anything. Darwin just said a tautology. Survival of the fittest, and they survive because they're most fit. That's circular reasoning. There's no proof of anything there. Okay, so what he's basically saying is the evolutionary biology textbooks are full of lies, and the reason they lie is to promote materialism, to promote atheism, and that's exactly true. I was a biology major, evolutionary biology at Stanford University. I was an A+ student in evolutionary biology. I've kept up with the subject over the years, reading lots of books about it, and I can tell you this guy's telling the truth 100%. And so is James Tour on Origin of Life, and Stephen Meyer, and Michael Behe, and Douglas Axe, all these guys. And as usual, the modern scientific method came from the Catholic Church, from Christianity, because Christianity says we are created in the image of God. He created everything. Therefore, because we're created in His image, we can study His creations. He's a rational God making a rational universe. As the Bible said, everything was made fit to size. So it's a rational universe. And that inspired people to study science. And like Thomas Aquinas said, when we study God's creation, we honor Him. So Christianity gets along great with true empirical science, meaning hypothesis, do an experiment, analyze data, potentially formulate new hypotheses, okay? But atheism does not. People think atheism is more objective. It is not. When atheism gets involved, it's a question of money. All right. So now let me go to the book, and I'll show you in much more detail what all this stuff is about, these icons of evolution. So first of all, here, let me shrink myself here. Charles Darwin wrote his book on the origin of species around 1859. Later on, they changed the name Darwinism to Neo-Darwinism. So Darwinism simply means natural selection, survival of the fittest, okay? But Neo-Darwinism, the new Darwinism, that came around after the 1930s as they started to incorporate the idea of genetics. And they thought that was going to help them prove that Darwinism was true. And later on, the discovery of DNA structure, Watson and Crick, 1953, and we've learned certainly a lot more about genetics since then. There was Mendel's, work with the pea plants, showing autosomal recessive, autosomal dominant type traits that could be inherited and selectively bred for, okay? By the way, origin of life chemistry is a totally different subject. That's geologic chemistry, before life. Biologic chemistry is after you already have life. Okay, but what I'm trying to say, this idea of creating genetic variation through mutations, it's nonsense. The reason is a genetic mutation is like scratching an audio CD with a paperclip, okay? You're not going to improve Bach, Beethoven, and Mozart with a paperclip. That's not going to happen. You're going to make it worse. Just imagine if you were writing, a computer programmer writes code for a computer program. Do you think you're going to improve it by scratching the code he's written on a CD with a paperclip? No, you're going to make it worse. It's obvious, okay? And this is well known amongst the people who really study this stuff, okay? There's all these phonies on the internet, and they're really just trying to promote atheism. They're not deep thinkers on the subject, okay? I've been heavily involved in this for a long time, since I was a little freshman in college, okay? All right, so let's go on here. Oh, he says, yeah, when you induce a mutation into a fruit fly, you don't get, a horsefly. You get either a normal fruit fly, a defective fruit fly, or a dead fruit fly, okay? And again, the concept of zombies is The Walking Dead. They keep putting the same stuff in the textbook because they don't have any proof of evolution. All they've got is a few bogus just-so stories, all right? They know it's not true. They're lying to you on purpose to promote atheism. A lot of your famous so-called Darwin biologists, they're really phonies who are just paid for by big money corporations. Like Richard Dawkins, he's subsidized by big money to promote atheism, okay? And it's the same thing with Nick Lane. Nick Lane is smart. I think Nick Lane's a brilliant guy, okay? And Richard Dawkins, he is a clever writer. There's no doubt about it, okay? But he's BSing the public. And so Nick Lane is trying to figure out origin of life, and he's smart, and he's done some good things, and I liked his books. I read all his books cover to cover multiple times, okay? He is a smart guy, and he's good. But he's funded by big money, okay? And I can tell you, the billionaire perverts are promoting atheism because they know that the stupid pros use evolutionary biology, and when they're told it's a fact, they stop believing in God. So it's a way to de-Christianize an entire country by teaching children in high school and college that evolution is proven there's no need for God, and that's completely untrue, okay? And so here's a quote from Jonathan Wells. Materialistic philosophy, as in atheism, is masquerading as empirical science, and he calls it zombie science. And that's exactly correct statement. He also says Linnaeus thought that God made the animals, but Darwin pushed the theory of evolution from an atheistic explanation. He had no evidence for this. Alfred Russel Wallace, who's sort of a co-discoverer of so-called evolutionary biology, Darwinism, thought it was from an overwhelming intelligence, from God, okay? Daniel Dennett, one of these atheist philosophers, he said that Darwin's dangerous idea of survival of the fittest as a mechanism of evolutionary biology is a universal acid that burns through everything traditional, meaning it destroys Christianity and everything else. The reality is they're two different subjects. And like I said, modern scientific method came from the Catholic Church. This is well known. I've given plenty of lectures on it. And Christianity gets along great with empirical science, with real science. It's the originator of science. That's why modern scientific method only happened in Europe. All these other countries, these atheistic countries and paganistic countries, it didn't come from them. It did not come from South America. It did not come from India. It did not come from Asia. It did not come from Africa. It only came from Christianity. It only came from Europe because Europe had Christianity. It came from Christianity. That's an important point. If you study science and science history, you will see that true. Now here's the next quote of Jonathan Wells. It's perfect. This is exactly the truth. There never was a war between religion and empirical science, but there is a war between religion and materialistic science, as in materialism means atheism, and the battleground is evolution, and that is correct. That's why they fight so far. That's why you get all these trolls when you explain the fact that evolution is fake, okay? It tells the truth about microevolution, variation in one species. It cannot explain any of the other stuff. Okay, so here's some of the icons of evolution, meaning things that they use as claims to support evolutionary biology, and you're going to see that every single one of them is fake. The Miller-Urey experiment, it used an atmosphere that's not relevant to the origin of life, and the synthetic products were so minimal, they're pathetic. You have to make a ton of things to have life. You have to make nucleotides for DNA and RNA. You have to make amino acids for proteins. You have to make all these lipids for your phospholipid bilayers. Okay, you have to be able to, you have to make carbohydrates. There's a lot of post-translational processing of proteins that includes lipids and carbohydrates, okay? And you have to have all that available simultaneously. And not only that, it has to be chiral. Look at my hands, the right and the left hand. You can make a mirror image of your hands, but you can't superimpose them. So that chirality means they have to be ability to be superimposed. The reaction end products of these early chemical reactions, they're not chiral, and they're full of contaminants. They're not biologically useful. James Tour is the best on that. I've linked you to some of his videos. You can just go to his YouTube channel. James Tour is the name of his YouTube channel. The guy's a genius, and he's the best guy to speak about the chemistry of origin of life. So the Miller-Urey experiment is bogus, all right? That's been well known for a long, long time. They still include that in textbooks, even though it's completely bogus, and everybody knows that. Okay, Darwin's phylogenetic tree, where they show all the different animals and plants arising from a common ancestor. That's completely made up. There is no data to support that. Okay, and homology, meaning similar shapes of a limb, for example, that's not definitive proof. Okay, you can have that happening in very different species. That can be just due to what is called analogous variation. It can be due to so-called convergent evolution. They then tried to produce more precise phylogenetic trees using DNA sequencing, the modern DNA sequencing techniques, and they can't get it to work because they can't line up the DNA correctly. So they'll get a bunch of different scientists, they'll keep producing different versions because none of them can agree because they don't have a standardized way to do it. So they can't prove phylogenetic trees either. They're bogus, they're fake, they're just made up, okay, to try to convince people, but there's no data behind them, okay? This is junk science. Junk DNA is actually, a lot of it's regulatory DNA, but this is junk science, okay? This is well known amongst people who study this stuff. Okay, I talked about the homology of limbs being much less reliable than was originally thought. They found all these so-called hominin fossils trying to find the evolutionary line to mankind, and the more they find, the less sense it makes. They can't make sense out of it, okay? Haeckel's embryo drawings, they were deliberately dishonest. He distorted the shape of them to try to make it seem that Darwin's idea was true, that they would have similar origins and they would gradually keep changing. But the opposite was true, and it does not match Darwin's theory. And this has been well known for many, many decades, but it still gets into the textbooks. So that was his point of Jonathan Wells. All of this stuff has been proven false, but they still put it in the textbooks. And that's a zombie, a walking dead that's difficult to kill because they won't stop putting this in the textbook because they don't have any good evidence, okay? Archaeopteryx claimed to be, a reptile-like dinosaur descendant of the modern birds, but now it's been shown that that's not the case. Okay, the peppered moth experiments was faked. This was the idea that in industrialized England, in the early 1800s, for example, the increased pollution produced a darkening of the trees, and that these pepper moths, there was a white version and a black version, that the black version became more abundant in number, more frequent in number for a while. And they said, oh, it's because of the pollution, because now they sit against the trees and the white ones get picked off by the birds, but the black ones can hide better because the polluted tree looks more black and it's camouflage. Well, guess what? They had all these photographs and drawings. Pepper moths don't rest on the side of trees. They were fake. They just, nailed them to the side of a tree and took a photograph. That's not, and glued them to the side of a tree. That's not real science. The thing was totally fake. Okay, and when they later looked into it, that was shown not to be the case. So the pepper moth was fake. They still put that in the textbooks, even though it's fake. Okay, Darwin's finches didn't prove anything. Variation within a species, a little bit, 5% difference in beak size, next to nothing, and it would come and it would go, these differences. It didn't show anything significant for evolution, okay? And the pepper moth was just a species variation. It's a variety within a species. It's a microevolution example, and it was false, okay? Four-winged flies produced by a few mutations. Look how easily we can produce a significant mutation. Yeah, these flies are debilitated cripples, okay? That's not any type of progressive improvement. They don't even have muscles connected to their accessory wings. Okay, the tree of primate evolution, I told you that was a joke. It's turning out that the biological similarity of humans and chimps is much, much more different. I gave an entire lecture on that in my book review of Jonathan Leith's book, The Primate Myth Exposed. They said, we have only 1% DNA difference now, and now it's more like 13.5 DNA difference, which is a lot because there's going to be some similarity. We got a lot of overlap with a tomato, okay, with a dandelion, just because there's a lot of things that are similar in all biological creatures. Okay, you got glycolysis cycle, Krebs cycle, mitochondria and stuff. So anyways, they're just all faked. Their whole primate tree of evolution and this idea of going from a knuckle walker to a gradually standing upright man, that's all made up just to make people think it's real, but there's no data behind that, all right? Then there's like the Cambrian expansion, okay? They don't have any transitional forms. They all came out of nowhere very rapidly. Again, that's consistent with God, an intelligent designer. The origin of life, consistent with God, an intelligent designer. The function of a mitochondria, consistent with God, an intelligent designer. The same thing for the human eye, the blood clotting system, okay, the flagella, okay, the immune system. It goes on and on. There's irreducible complexity to all these things where multiple things had to be simultaneously present. Orphan genes, they can't explain that. Orphan genes are unique to an individual species, meaning that they don't have a homologue in these other ones. You can't say this came from anywhere because it's unique to that species. All of this is consistent with intelligent design. I can tell you, I've been studying this for, over 40 years, 45 years, and intelligent design is what makes sense. The real scientists, that's what they believe. All these phony BS artists on the internet, they're going to promote atheism. The reason why atheism gets promoted is, think about it. Imagine you're one of the billionaire perverts. You want atheism because what that means, if there is no God, that means whoever's got the most money is like a god. They want to be like gods, like Roman emperors. Think about it. If they become like gods, like Roman emperors, they could do whatever they want. You know, remember what some of the bad Roman emperors did. They would want a new woman in their bed every day. They could say, every day in my bed, I want a new woman. I want a new 20-year-old beautiful woman in my bed. Okay? And they would get it because they were like gods on earth. They had that level of power. And that's what these guys want. And they also want all kinds of things, total power. And that's how they get it. They have to get rid of Christianity. That's why there's all this persecution and attempts to destroy Christianity, because that's what it needs. That's what's needed to produce atheism. They figured that the other religions, they can control them easily, but they can't control the Christians. That's what that's all about. They think, oh, the Muslims, they can control the Muslims easy. They can get rid of them easily, but they can't get rid of the Christians so easily. So they can use the Muslims to do things for them, but they can't control them. Okay, they can't control the Christians. They think they can control the Muslims. They think they can control all the other religions except for Christians. That's why Christianity gets persecuted. Just so you know, that's why that's all about. And that's why Darwin's evolutionary biology is emphasized in school. That's why if a college professor, mentions intelligent design to students, they'll get fired for heresy. Okay, it's a fact. This is all well known by people who study this. Okay. Anyways, we'll leave it at that tonight, but look at the Cambrian expansion. The trilobites would show up. All these fully formed phyla and trilobites with these perfectly formed, very complex eyes, okay? There was no preceding transitional forms. Darwin knew there were no transitional forms. He just hoped they would eventually be discovered. And he also said, if they don't find transitional forms, that proves my idea was wrong. Yeah, right. Intelligent design is what makes sense. You start looking at protein synthesis. You start looking at RNA world versus DNA world, all this nonsense about origin of life. No, compare the work of Nick Lane on Origin of Life to James Tour. There's no comparison. James Tour is up here. Nick Lane, he's a bright guy. He's doing the best he can with what he's got, but he's not even in the ballpark. Anyways, it's a great book. If you're serious about learning about evolution, I recommend you read it. Jonathan Wells is a brilliant guy. So anyways, I hope you found this helpful.